Sudan's transitional talks in limbo after the African Union pulls out. The AU says discussions have been dishonest, but critics argue it's the AU who's cynically taking sides. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Sudan. In 2019, after months of unrest, Omar al Bashir was forced to step down. The Sudanese president was one of the world's longest ruling dictators. So when he fell, Sudan finally had a chance at democracy. But after decades of autocratic rule, a transition wouldn't be easy. And over the past 3 years, there have been a number of setbacks. Talks to get the country back on track to civilian rule were dealt another blow this week after the African Union said this.
The African Union cannot continue these dishonest and opaque discussions which exclude participants or treat them unfairly.
But the African Union's role in Sudan has been repeatedly called into question. In a moment, we'll look at how the AU has engaged Khartoum since the military coup. But first, let's take a closer look at the organization itself.
In July 2002, the African Union was formed in Durban. It was a successor to the Organization of African Unity. The bloc's main aims are to achieve solidarity and integration between African countries and to promote peace and security in the continent. It has 10 governing organs, including the Peace and Security Council and the Pan-African Parliament. It's conducted several peacekeeping operations across the continent, including in Somalia, Sudan, Mali, and Burundi. The Union has 55 member states, with Morocco becoming the latest to join in 2017.
Well, after last year's military coup forced the civilian government from power, the African Union suspended Sudan's membership and foreign donors cut vital aid to the country. Since then, the economy has been spiraling out of control and protests take place almost daily. Many of the demonstrations have turned violent, and the military is accused of using excessive force. Many pro-democracy protesters have lost their lives as a result. The UN has set up talks to try to mediate, along with the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, or IGAD, plus the African Union. But every single significant civilian group has boycotted those negotiations. And the African Union says that without them, a solution is impossible.
The honorable attendees must know that, in our view, as a mechanism, we cannot imagine a satisfactory political solution without the participation of these absentees.
But does the African Union really have civilian groups' interests at heart? Some don't think so. Joining me now to debate that and more is from Khartoum, Sudanese activist Hamid Khalafallah. Also in the Sudanese capital is Rabie Abdul Atti Obeid. He is a former senior official with Sudan's National Congress Party. And from Washington, we have Hudson, the former chief of staff to the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, if you only read the headlines, you would logically conclude the African Union has given up on these talks because of the lack of participation by civilian groups. So, Rabie Abdul Atti Obeid, is that the gist of it?
Yes, I think that the African Union, they said that they didn't withdraw from the dialogue and negotiation, but they actually opposing the way of discussion and the way of negotiation, because this way is excluding a lot of political parties, and this is not agreed upon by African Union, and this is their remarks up to now for the negotiation which is running now.
Okay, so let me ask Hamid if you're on the same page there, because from what I gather, you seem to think that the African Union actually is the problem. It is not the boycott on behalf of these civilian groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I would never be on the same page with Mr. Abdul Atti, a senior former member of the NCP. The African Union has shown clear political intent towards the process in Sudan, specifically by the recent move and announcement they made where they wanted to suspend their participation in the meetings facilitated by the tripartite. When they made the announcement, the Ambassador Bilaish, representing the African Union, he had to his side two of the Juba Peace Agreement signatories who are pro the coup and pro-military. So they have been showing this clear inclination to supporting these actors and to giving fake weight to the coup. And when they speak about the exclusion of who? Which they've never mentioned who do they want to see as part of the process. However, all the hints and the indicators that they have been showing are showing that they are, opposing the exclusion of pro-Islamist and pro-military actors in Sudan, which are, which shouldn't be part of the process, have no right being part of the process because they are supporting the coup anyway. So they have no problem with the status quo. So I don't see why they need to be included in talks about ending the current situation.
Okay, Rabie, Abdullah, Obeid, I'd just like to get your response to what you've heard there, because he is saying that the African Union is effectively picking and choosing whom they want to participate in these talks. This is not about civilian groups not wanting to participate.
Yes, actually, the African Union is opposing this exclusion of a lot of political parties, not Islamists only, not Islamic groups only. As I said, that Islamic group is a wide group, actually millions of people who are now supporting the Islamic group. But I think that if this negotiation is going like that, these talks going like that, I think that the result will be not in the actually in the sake of the stability in Sudan. Instead of forming a government which will meet the requirement of Sudan people, they will form a government which will distract and which will lead to instability. Because if you exclude a very big group, that means the result will be very poor result. And this poor result will actually reflect on the political situation, economic situation, the social situation, and also will make a lot of negative impact on the interim period, which decided to be ended in the year 2023.
Cameron Hudson, is the African Union an honest broker here?
Well, certainly not in the eyes of the pro-democracy forces which dominate, I think, right now the street and across the country. Let's look back at a few, I think, kind of key facts. One, when these talks were launched under originally Security Council mandate, UN Security Council mandate, and given to UNITAMs, the African Union was not a part and did not want to have any role in this. They didn't play an active role in trying to mediate, and they were leaving everything essentially to the United Nations. It was only after an intervention by General Dagalo going to Addis Ababa, meeting with Moussa Faki, AU chairman, that he implored upon him for the African Union to play a more active role. And when they did, they came in on the side of the military, they came in on the side of the former regime, ensuring that those voices were included. But I think we have to remember that the point of these talks and the scope of the talks was limited to those groups that signed the 2019 constitutional declaration, which did not include coup makers, which did not include former Islamist groups. And so here you have the African Union stepping in and forcing a seat at the table for groups who are essentially on the outs with the Sudanese people. The entire revolution was to get rid of the NCP and the Bashir regime. And here it is, the African Union giving them a seat at the table and complaining if the talks are not at least balanced among the groups, and if not in their favor. So I think that from the view of the Sudanese street, this is completely contrary to their wishes and to the demands of the revolution.
I mean, Cameron, would you describe it as even duplicitous? Because you've said that the AU had clearly tried to rebalance talks in favor of the military and Islamist forces. So, I mean, how clearly did they try to do that? How obvious has it been to those both inside and outside of the talks?
Well, I mean, let's just go back 2 weeks ago to the very first day of the talks, when the only people who showed up to the talks were Islamist and pro-coup groups. There wasn't a single civilian politician or member of resistance committees, members of any kind of pro-democracy group. It was a protest move on their part to protest the fact that the AU demanded and put at the table these forces who are opposed to the transition of the country, to opposed to democratic rule. And again, as your other guest pointed out, when the AU gave its press conference this week saying that it was essentially withdrawing from those talks, it was flanked by pro-coup forces. So they have very clearly aligned themselves with the pro-coup forces, and I think we have to take a step back even further. The AU is often, I think, alleged to be in support of existing regimes, existing power structures, and I think we're seeing that play out here today.
Okay. Hamid, at this point, I'd actually like to ask you, as a Sudanese civilian yourself, where all of this has left Sudan. What are people going through now inside the country? Because these talks have failed, and we are where we are now, you are still not getting the foreign aid that was due. Economic engagement from the outside has been limited at best, and it will not get better unless the strategy of the military government now is to just simply wait it out and see if the world just forgives them somehow for being there long enough that they'll just default and deal with the military government. So where are the Sudanese people now?
So the mobilization in the streets and
Yes.
the action that the Sudanese population had continuously ever since the coup was launched in October or 25th of October last year have shown that the Sudanese people are not interested in, bypassing any of the issues and submitting to economic pressures and other issues that are facing the country. The Sudanese population, at large, are very much determined to solve the fundamental roots of these problems, which is military intervention in governance. And this is where all the issues have been arising and so on. And everyone is very determined to work on that. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, in the same square where we are, Sudanese people taking to the streets in large numbers and getting very violently oppressed and protests getting cracked down by the military and its allies and so on. But the real problem lies in the problematic, definition of the current political crisis, if we may call it. There isn't a problem here now about civilian groups not being unified and some civilian groups being excluded and so on, the way so many people are trying to point out. The civilian actors, pro-democracy actors, are unified in one thing: ending the current status quo, putting an end to the military coup that is governing the country. Then the details would be worked out at a later point. However, I think there's also one problem of how the term civilians is being used very vaguely to kind of show that there are civilian actors who have different interests and so on. I think the right way to do this classification is to classify actors in Sudan in terms of pro-democracy and anti-coup actors. And then you have pro-coup actors like Mr. Abdullahi and other Islamist groups and some of the Juba Peace Agreement signatories.
Okay. Mr. Abdullahi, I heard you had a response earlier. If you'd like to go ahead, do so at this point, or I can move on to another question with you.
Yes, I think that Sudanese people, they have higher sensitivity against foreigners and against any involvement of people coming even from United Nations or from United States or from Britain or from even African Union. Whereas African Union, I think that has some acceptance to some extent. But I think that Yeah, whenever when we speak about the coup that happened on 25 of October, I think that the coup not happened on 25 of October. The coup happened 11 April 2019, because after 11 April 2019, a lot of deterioration happened. The economy actually going down. The lifestyle of the people also is very terrible, and everything, even security, there is no security, there is no, rule of law. Everything is, turned upside down from 11th April 2019. Whereas the Salvation Front, during 30 years, that led by Omar al Bashir, Sudanese people, they live prosperity in spite of sanctions, in spite of that Sudan has been included in the list of countries sponsoring terrorism. During the 30 years, the government of
Okay.
Salvation breaks through in all aspects. Even they produce petrol, they build universities, they build bridges, they build roads. And Sudanese people, they live luxurious and prosperous life during some time in the years 30, in the past 30 years that ruled by the National Congress Party led by Omar al.
Cameron, I'll let you
And I
respond.
think that if
I mean, is it
the African Union,
according?
if the African Union,
Okay.
if the African Union, yeah, please, if the African Union and Volker of the United Nations envoy and IGAD, if they have withdrawn, I think that it will be better, because Sudanese people, they have experience.
Fair enough. But
And
Cameron,
it
I do
was
want to
a
get your
very big
response to
mistake
what was
that
being said about
the former prime minister,
the events of 2019 actually
yes, okay.
interrupting the stable and prosperous lives of the Sudanese people. How many people see it that way?
Well, I don't know what country he's talking about, but it's certainly not Sudan. There's no factual basis in anything that your guest just said in terms of lives of prosperity, lives of peace. I would argue that the international community has fed more Sudanese people than the Sudanese government over the last 30 years. They have been a terrorist state for many of those years. They've been under sanctions for many of those years, which did not contribute to wealth creation in the country. But let's not forget. And what we're hearing here from your guests is an old trope of the Islamist government, which is without us, there'll be no stability. And dictators have been making this argument for centuries. And we're hearing them make it again today. That's why you see so many people in the streets, because it is just not to be believed. The military government under Omar al Bashir delivered nothing but pain and misery to 45 million people across the country. That's why these protests have not stopped. That's why people are willing to die in the streets today, over 100 of them, since the protests began in October against the coup. That's why they are not going home, because of the lies, because of the harassment, because of the deprivation that Sudanese have experienced, not just in their economic lives, but in their political and social lives as well. And so I
Okay.
think that it's just offensive, frankly, to hear these comments, which are just completely fictitious.
I just want to hear Hamid's response to that, because as a Sudanese person, to hear that your stability, your prosperity, as a citizen of Sudan was disrupted actually by what happened in 2019. What do you make of that?
Well, the only prosperous and luxurious life that Sudanese people have seen during the Bashir regime was for the lives of the likes of Mr. Abdullahi, the allies and the members of the NCP regime. So maybe he is resenting having lost the privileges that he has acquired through being part of that regime. And I'm not sorry for your loss, Mr. Abdullahi. As for the public Sudanese, the Bashir regime has been completely oppressive and repressive, and I find it just very, as Mr. Hudson just mentioned, offensive to try to go back into that discussion after millions of people have been out in the streets, after hundreds of people were killed by the regime of Bashir and afterwards by the military leaders. So I think it's very offensive that Mr. Abdullahi is still making such claims, and I think it is it has nothing true in that. There is no truth in what he was saying and in the facts the non-facts that he's trying to make. And I really resent that after all the sacrifices of the Sudanese people, Mr. Abdullahi and the allies of the Islamists are still trying to make such arguments and claims.
And it's worrisome, I think, because it doesn't bode well then, and Mr. Abdullahi, I'll come back to you, it doesn't bode well for the prospects of multi-party and multi-participant talks going forward. If it seems that the parties representing your interests really think these talks are a mistake from the beginning, that Sudan never should have been disrupted in the way it was. So how do you propose going forward now in negotiations for a transition to democracy?
I think that your guest in Washington is not saying the truth. Actually, NCP members, they didn't only enjoy that prosperity, because at that time, the gallon of benzene was only $0.50. Now, the gallon of benzene is $6. The gallon of benzene, not only the people not enjoyed, only the NCP people, they enjoyed that. Yeah. 40 universities, not NCP only members, they entered in these universities, bridges, and oil that produced not for NCP people. And the piece of bread from £1 now 50 pounds. All the people, they
I was asking, however, about engaging in the talks and engaging the various interests that are now at stake. This is supposed to be about a transition.
I think that there is no way. There is no way to exclude Islamic group, because Islamic group is a wide group, millions of people, and also some other supporters of Islamic group. Also, they are not a few number of people, and they think that it is better for Volker and for all people involved in the negotiation and talks to withdraw themselves, because Sudanese people, they are capable to solve their problem according to their experience, according to their history. And I think that now, at last, eventually, and ultimately, I think that Volker and his group will fail. If not fail, I think that they will lead to more destruction and more instability in Sudan, which will not be actually accepted by Sudan people. And Sudan people, as I said to you, that they have high sensitivity against foreigners. And this is the history. I am not speaking something not from the history. The history of Sudan is saying like that.
We only have a couple minutes left. Cameron, I mean, I was hoping to get more of a sense of optimism going forward, because originally you'd said that it might actually be a good thing that the AU is stepping aside, because it will be helpful in allowing a reset for the entire process. But hearing where the other side is actually coming from, I'm not sure if a reset could even help at this point. And getting other parties involved from the outside, you had mentioned the United States perhaps playing a larger role at some point, even Saudi possibly, if that would actually help or hinder this process even more.
Well, I think we have to be open to all options. It's clear that this process has had a number of false starts and missteps since it was launched at the beginning of this year. And so we have to think about perhaps two tracks, one of a technical nature, where consultations are held and there's agreement on what the process looks like and who actually participates in this process. And then you have a political process of actual face-to-face negotiations between civilian and military forces. So we have to consider that there could be two tracks to this negotiation that happens. But at the end of the day, I think we have to go back to the first principles of what these talks are about. These talks are about reestablishing a transition that leads to democratic elections in the country. That transition did not include NCP forces. The NCP was removed. There was a committee that was established to remove the NCP from public life, to take away holdings, real estate, financial investments, companies of the NCP. Now, the military has reestablished many of these people in their jobs and many of these companies because they needed political allies, because they were losing the popular opinion of the Sudanese people. But we cannot forget, and we have to go back to 2019. The reason for the revolution, the reason for civilian transition was to rid the country of the NCP. To give them a seat at the table now goes against everything that this revolution stands for, and the United Nations should not have allowed it in the first place.
Okay. Cameron, you will have to have the final word. I'm sure we'll be talking about this again at length in the near future. I'd like to thank all three of my guests so much, really, for being with us on a fascinating discussion. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.